Hello friends, how are you? Hope you are doing well. Let us continue our discussion related to the marathon GHG emission inventory examples. So we'll continue from example number 37, which is about scope 3 upstream transportation and these emissions from transportation goods by truck, and which is a common mode of transport from short to medium distances actually. So road free, the distance traveled, that is 1000 kilometers. This is the emission factor, road fleet emission factor. Okay, and we have taken reference of EPA. This is the calculation, 1000 kilometer distance multiplied with the emission factor. So that's how we can calculate the emissions for this. The emission which are basically from transporting the goods by truck. Okay, as I said to you, this is the example we have taken. Next example is scope 3, again business travel, that is by using the taxis. The total distance traveled, emission factor. Then this is, we have taken from taxi emission factors, and EPA is the reference website. You can go through the calculation, total distance multiplied with the emission factor, emission coming from the fuel used in taxis, typically gasoline or diesel, which emits CO2 when they are burned or combustion is happening. Example number 39 is scope 3, purchase goods and services. That's for the packaging material. Okay, let's say 1000 units packaged, and this is the emission factor, packaging emission factor, which is coming from the supplier data, and you just multiply the number of units with the emission factor. So this emissions coming from the production of packaging materials such as plastics, papers and cardboards, including energy and metal extractions also. So basically all the packaging material which we are utilizing. The next scope 3 is use of sold products. Let's say suppose we sold air conditioning units, 200 units were sold, emission factor is 100 kg. Okay, CO2 equivalent per unit. Emissions which are basically from the energy uses in the whole life cycle of the sold product. The emission factors we are getting from the manufacturer data. So to calculate the total emissions, we can say 200 multiplied with the emission factor. So these emissions are basically generated during the operational life, keep in mind, of air conditioning units using electricity when derived from the fossil fuels. Okay, example number 41 is scope 3 again, end of the life treatment of the sold products. So let's say suppose we are focusing on recycling of electronic items, 100 units multiplied with the emission factor. We can get this emission factor from the e-waste recycling facilities, and the reference is EPA. So calculate the total GHG emissions related to this example, 100 units into 5 kg of emission factor. So emission occur when the processing and recycling of e-waste actually. Okay, where we have very energy intensive processes contributing to CO2 emissions. Scope 1, again one example related to GHG emissions from the company vehicles. We are utilizing LPG vehicle, let's say 100 liters of LPG used. This is the emission factor. And now we are utilizing standard emission factors for LPG, let's say taking reference of EPA. Emissions from the combustion of LPG, propane basically, butane and propane in company vehicles producing CO2 and other minor pollutants. Example number 43 is scope 3, basically employee commuting. Let's say taking example cycling, 1000 kilometers cycling. Okay, but what is happening, you see here, zero emissions because of cycling only. So no emissions. So no emissions are generated for the cycling, and which is a carbon neutral form of transport. Okay, then example number 44 is scope 2, indirect emissions from purchased electricity, and that is because of heating. Okay, heating is the activity where we are utilizing electricity, 4000 kilowatt units, and you can see multiplication for the emission factor, regional grid mix. We are utilizing this emission factor from the local utilities. Okay, so multiply with the electricity purchased with the emission factor, you will get the answer. So these indirect emissions are generated by the electricity which is used to provide heating in the building, with the source of mix likely including fossil fuels only. Okay, the next example is 45 number, scope 3, downstream transportation. Let's say last mile delivery, 100 kilometers traveled. We utilized this last mile emission factor. EPA is the reference website. Again, these are the emissions which are generated from the delivery of the goods from distribution centers to the final customers. Okay, typically done by the delivery vans and all, right? So you can get the calculation done, distance traveled with the emission factor. Then 46 is scope 3 again, upstream transportation. Let's say bulk shipping is happening 2000 kilometers. This is the emission factor. Bulk shipping emission factor, EPA is the reference website. These emissions from bulk shipping, cost effective but carbon intensive transportation method is. Scope 1, GHG emissions from heating system. Oil heating, let's say suppose this is the oil quantity consumed. Emission factor for the heating oil. This is the reference for selecting the emission factor, EPA website. What we did here, the total quantity of the oil used multiplied with the emission factor. What is happening, basically these emissions are coming from combustion of this heating oil used to heat a building, producing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. 48, okay, scope 2, indirect emission from the purchased electricity, like office equipment uses 1000 kilowatt used. Grid emission, again look from the local utility, multiply with the total quantity of electricity consumed and the emission factor. So emission arise indirectly electricity consumed, so as we have done it earlier also. So basically the power is coming from the fossil fuel, so we can consider the emissions. Scope 3, again employee business travel, utilizing the car. What is the travel distance? This is the multiplication done and we calculate the emission basically from the gasoline or diesel in the business travel actually. Thank you friends. Let's consider other examples in the next discussion. Thank you.